Welcome back, fellow time travelers, to another episode of Seeds of History. I'm your guide, Bennett Tanton, and today we're embarking on a journey into one of the most mysterious and mind-bending chapters of America's past. Now, I know what you're thinking. Bennett, where are we going today? Rome? Egypt? Some far-off exotic land? Nope. We're not flying over oceans or crossing deserts. We're staying right here in good old North America. Though, about 1,000 years ago, this land was home to a metropolis that would rival the great cities of the world. Ever heard of Cahokia? No? Well, buckle up. You're about to get schooled. You see, we've all heard about places like Athens, or the towering ziggurats of Mesopotamia. But what if I told you that here in America, long before the likes of Columbus even thought about setting sail, there was a city as large as London or Paris? Yep, it existed, right near present-day St. Louis, in the heart of the Midwest. This city wasn't a sleepy little village with some huts. It was a thriving metropolis with a population that could hit 20,000. This was Cahokia, the center of the Mississippian culture, and it was booming. They built mounds that rivaled the pyramids and had trade routes stretching across the continent. But as quickly as it rose, Cahokia mysteriously declined. And we still don't know exactly why. Over the next hour, we're going to dig into this ancient American city, its rise, its innovations, and its strange disappearance. We'll walk through Cahokia's streets, stand atop its ceremonial mounds, and wonder what life was like for the people who called this forgotten metropolis home. Oh, and don't worry, we'll sprinkle in a little humor along the way because, hey, history doesn't have to be boring, right? But before we jump in, a quick reminder. If you love what you hear, and you're itching for more stories from the past that don't make it into the mainstream history books, please take a moment to hit subscribe, leave a review, and share this podcast with your friends. Seriously, your reviews help us spread the seeds of history far and wide. All right, with that little bit of housekeeping out of the way, let's jump into the fascinating world of Cahokia. You ready? Let's go. Let's start at the beginning. Cahokia didn't just pop up overnight. This metropolis was the product of centuries of cultural and technological evolution. We're talking about the Mississippian culture, which started emerging around 800 AD. Picture this, a group of people with a knack for farming, especially maize, or corn as we call it today, who began settling along the mighty Mississippi River. These weren't just wandering hunter-gatherers. They were skilled farmers, and that agricultural success is what made Cahokia possible. Now, Cahokia itself starts to form around 1050 AD. It's like that moment in your favorite TV show when everything comes together and the plot really starts moving. But what made Cahokia different from other settlements at the time? Well, for one, it wasn't a small village. We're talking big city vibes here, folks. Major infrastructure, bustling marketplaces, and most notably, those giant mounds. And let me just say this, these weren't your run-of-the-mill dirt piles. No, sir, these mounds were purpose-built, strategically designed, and some of them were massive. We'll get into the specifics in a bit, but imagine a city that isn't based around skyscrapers like today. Instead, you've got these towering earthen structures that served as political, religious, and even residential hubs. It's like an ancient urban planning masterclass. If you're picturing a community of mud huts scattered around, you got the wrong idea. Cahokia was organized. Think grids, plazas, and neighborhoods, all oriented around these huge mounds. It's almost like the Mississippians had their own version of city zoning. But hold up, how did Cahokia go from a small settlement to the grand city it became? The answer lies in two words: agriculture and trade. Cahokia's success was built on corn. The Mississippians cultivated it, harvested it, and basically turned it into the foundation of their economy. And with this surplus of food, they didn't just feed themselves, they traded it. Cahokia became the beating heart of a trade network that stretched across North America. We're talking about trade routes that went from the Great Lakes down to the Gulf of Mexico, and from the Atlantic coast to the Rocky Mountains. It was like the Amazon prime of the pre-Columbian world, with goods and ideas flowing into the city from all directions. They traded not just food, but also raw materials, copper from the Great Lakes, shells from the Gulf Coast, even obsidian from the Rocky Mountains. And with all of this wealth flowing in, Cahokia became a cultural and political powerhouse. They weren't just rich in corn and trade goods, they were rich in ideas, art, and social structures. It's like they had everything they needed to build an empire, and they knew it. But of course, with great power comes great mounds. Yeah, I said it. These mounds weren't just ceremonial or political symbols. They were a physical representation of Cahokia's power and prestige. And the biggest of them all? Monk's Mound. This thing was like the Empire State Building of the pre-Columbian Midwest. Standing at a towering 100 feet, it covered more than 14 acres at its base. To give you some context, that's larger than the base of the Great Pyramid of Giza. And just like the pyramids, Monk's Mound didn't build itself. It was constructed over the course of centuries, layer by layer, by hand. Imagine the amount of labor, organization, and coordination that would have required. So why go to all that trouble? Well, it wasn't just about flexing on the neighboring towns. Monk's Mound and the dozens of smaller mounds scattered across the city served very specific purposes. Some were burial sites for the elite, others were platforms for important ceremonies, and some might have even been homes for Cahokia's ruling class. But here's the thing. These mounds were as much political as they were religious. By controlling the mounds, the leaders of Cahokia were controlling the spiritual and political heart of the city. It was a powerful statement. We built these mounds, and we run this city. But there's more to the story. Cahokia wasn't just a city of mounds and maze. It was a city with a pulse, a place where thousands of people lived, worked, and thrived. And it was unlike anything else in North America at the time. All right, now that we've got the basics of Cahokia's rise, we're going to dive into those monumental mounds a little deeper. What were they really used for? And how did Cahokia's leaders manage to organize such a massive undertaking? Stick around because you won't want to miss this part. So, let's talk about the mounds. And no, I'm not talking about the kind your dog digs up in the backyard. We're talking about monumental earthworks that symbolize the heart of Cahokia's society. You see, these weren't just piles of dirt for fun. These were carefully planned, meticulously constructed, and deeply meaningful. Imagine ancient people looking at these mounds, not just as buildings, but as representations of their culture, religion, and political structure. Now, I mentioned Monk's Mound earlier, the big kahuna of Cahokia. But Cahokia wasn't just about Monk's Mound. This city was literally covered in mounds, 120 of them to be exact. That's right, 120. Cahokia was like a forest of earthen skyscrapers, each with its own significance. These mounds came in various shapes and sizes, and each served a different purpose. Some were flat-topped and acted as platforms for temples or the homes of elite rulers. Others were cone-shaped and used for burial, housing the remains of important figures in Cahokian society. Let's take a closer look at Monk's Mound, because honestly, this thing is an engineering marvel. It wasn't built in a day. It was constructed over the course of several centuries, and layer by layer, it rose higher and higher. Imagine thousands of people hauling basketfuls of dirt, by hand, mind you, just to build a platform for the city's leaders to conduct ceremonies or hold council meetings. At its height, Monk's Mound stood at over 100 feet, which for pre-Columbian America was a big deal. The amount of organization, planning, and sheer labor that went into building this colossal structure is staggering. And remember, they didn't have bulldozers or cranes. Every inch of that mound was shaped by human hands. But why go through all this effort? Well, the mounds were not just about making Cahokia look cool from a distance, although, let's be honest, they did. These mounds were the beating heart of Cahokian religion and politics. Picture this. You're standing in the central plaza of Cahokia, surrounded by towering mounds. In the distance, you see Monk's Mound dominating the skyline. This is where the elite class lived and ruled, perched high above the common folk. It was a literal and symbolic representation of their power. They lived on top of the world, quite literally, while the rest of the population lived below, reinforcing the social hierarchy. And let's not forget the ceremonial side of things. Cahokia's mounds weren't just political platforms. They were spiritual spaces too. Some scholars believe that ceremonies held atop these mounds were meant to connect the earthly world with the spiritual realm above. It's like Cahokia was one big religious center, with the mounds acting as sacred conduits between the people and the gods. Now, speaking of the gods, there's something even more fascinating tied to Cahokia's mounds: human sacrifice. Yeah, you heard that right. Archaeologists have found evidence of human sacrifices in some of the burial mounds. Take, for example, Mound 72. This mound holds the remains of over 250 people, many of whom were buried as sacrificial offerings. Among the burials, archaeologists found the remains of 4 young women, laid out in a very deliberate and ceremonial manner, while other burials in the same mound showed signs of violent death. It's a grim reminder that Cahokia wasn't all sunshine and trade routes. It had a dark side too. So, what was all this for? Why build these massive structures and sacrifice people? Well, it all comes back to power and control. The ruling class of Cahokia used these mounds and rituals to maintain their grip on the population. They built the mounds to assert their authority, held ceremonies to legitimize their rule, and even resorted to human sacrifice to strengthen their spiritual and political power. The mounds weren't just landmarks. They were symbols of a social structure that kept Cahokia running smoothly, or at least for a while. It's kind of wild when you think about it, right? I mean, here's this ancient society building these monumental structures and performing elaborate rituals, all without written language, without metal tools, without any of the stuff we associate with advanced civilizations. But make no mistake, the people of Cahokia were advanced. They had mastered the art of urban planning, governance, and spirituality, and the mounds were the epicenter of it all. But while the mounds stood as symbols of power and unity, Cahokia's success wasn't just built on dirt and ritual. The city thrived because it was connected to a vast network of trade routes that spanned the continent. Next, we'll dig into Cahokia's role as a major trading hub and how goods, ideas, and people flowed through this ancient metropolis like water through the Mississippi. All right, so we've explored Cahokia's mighty mounds and the rituals that took place on top of them. But how exactly did this city support itself? I mean, a city of 20,000 people doesn't just pop up without a little economic backbone, right? Cahokia wasn't just a spiritual and political hub. It was also a major trade center, connecting people and goods from all over North America. Picture it as the ancient version of a bustling port city, only instead of ships and crates, we've got dugout canoes and handmade goods. So, what was it about Cahokia's location that made it such a prime spot for trade? Well, it all comes down to geography. Cahokia was strategically situated near the confluence of three major rivers: the Mississippi, the Missouri, and the Illinois. This wasn't just a happy accident. These rivers acted as highways, connecting Cahokia to regions far and wide. From the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, Cahokia's trade routes extended across thousands of miles, linking together different cultures and resources. Now, you might be wondering, what exactly was being traded? Let me paint a picture. Imagine the markets of Cahokia filled with goods from all corners of the continent. Copper from the Great Lakes, marine shells from the Gulf Coast, obsidian from the Rocky Mountains, and exotic stones like mica from the Appalachian region. These weren't just raw materials either. The people of Cahokia were skilled craftsmen who turned these materials into beautiful and highly sought-after objects like copper ornaments, shell beads, and intricately carved stone tools. In fact, Cahokian artisans were so good at what they did that their goods have been found at archaeological sites hundreds of miles away. That's how far Cahokia's influence reached. But trade in Cahokia wasn't just about material goods. It was about ideas, too. You see, trade brought people into contact with each other, and with that came the exchange of knowledge, technology, and cultural practices. When traders from distant lands arrived in Cahokia, they didn't just bring copper or shells. They brought stories, songs, beliefs, and technologies. This cross-pollination of cultures made Cahokia a melting pot of ideas and innovations. It was a city where diverse peoples and cultures met, mingled, and left their mark. One of the coolest examples of this cultural exchange is the Cahokian Plaza. This massive open space in the center of the city was likely influenced by Mesoamerican city designs, particularly those from the Maya and Aztec civilizations further south. It's almost as if Cahokia was taking notes from the great cities of Central America. There's even speculation that some elements of Cahokian religious beliefs, like their emphasis on the sun and solar deities were influenced by Mesoamerican cultures. So Cahokia wasn't just a backwater town doing its own thing in isolation. It was plugged into a much larger cultural and economic network. Now, all of this trade didn't just happen by accident. It required leadership, people who could organize and maintain these vast trade networks, negotiate deals, and keep the goods flowing. And this is where Cahokia's elite class came in. These were the movers and shakers of Cahokia's economy. They controlled the flow of goods, managed the labor force, and ensured that Cahokia remained the center of this trade web. In return, they reaped the rewards, becoming wealthier, more powerful, and more influential. But here's where things get really interesting. Cahokia wasn't a market economy in the way we think of today. There wasn't money changing hands or an ancient version of Wall Street. Instead, trade in Cahokia was likely based on reciprocity and gift-giving. This means that instead of buying and selling goods, people exchanged gifts as a way of building relationships and alliances. It's kind of like showing up to a party with a bottle of wine. You're not paying for the invite. You're offering a gesture that strengthens social bonds. Cahokia's elite would have been masters at this system of gift-giving, using it to forge alliances and expand their influence across the region. So, we've got an elite class with control over trade and politics, and a city at the crossroads of North America's trade routes. But this booming metropolis didn't stay on top forever. Just as quickly as Cahokia rose, it began to fall. And in the next segment, we'll explore the mysterious decline of Cahokia, how environmental pressures, social unrest, and maybe even a few bad decisions led to the collapse of one of North America's greatest cities. All right, we've covered Cahokia's rise, its monumental mounds, and its bustling trade network. But now we get to the part that has puzzled historians and archaeologists for years, the sudden decline of Cahokia. How does a city as advanced and powerful as Cahokia just fall apart? What could have caused this metropolis, which at its peak housed as many as 20,000 people, to vanish so quickly? Well, like most great mysteries in history, there isn't one clear answer. There are a lot of theories. And trust me, some of them get pretty wild. Let's start with the environmental angle. You see, Cahokia's success was deeply tied to its ability to produce massive amounts of food, especially maize. But when you rely on a single resource to support a large population, things can go south real quick if that resource starts to run out. Scholars believe that Cahokia's intensive agricultural practices might have led to deforestation and soil exhaustion. Think about it. Cahokia wasn't just feeding its own people, but also supporting its role as a trade hub. This meant large-scale farming operations that could have drained the land of nutrients over time. As the land became less fertile, crop yields would have dropped, leading to food shortages, which, as we all know from history, tends to make people, well, a bit cranky. But environmental stress didn't stop with farming. Cahokia was also vulnerable to flooding. The Mississippi River is a force to be reckoned with, and there's evidence that major floods could have devastated Cahokia's agricultural fields. Combine that with the possibility of droughts in the region, and you've got a recipe for disaster. These environmental challenges may have pushed Cahokia's resources to the breaking point, leading to a domino effect of societal breakdown. Now, let's take a look at the human factor, because it's not just Mother Nature that can cause a civilization to crumble. Imagine you're living in Cahokia around the year 1300. The population has grown, food is getting harder to come by, and the elite class is still sitting pretty on top of those massive mounds, making decisions that may or may not be in your best interest. Tensions are rising. Some scholars believe that social unrest played a major role in Cahokia's decline. As resources became scarcer, inequality between the elite and the common folk might have intensified. This would have led to political instability, internal conflict, and possibly even rebellion. When people are starving, they start to question the folks at the top, and if the leadership in Cahokia couldn't adapt to these challenges, it's possible the social fabric began to tear. But that's not all. There's also the theory that Cahokia's decline may have been influenced by warfare. Evidence of fortifications around the city suggests that Cahokia wasn't always at peace with its neighbors. Some researchers believe that Cahokia faced external threats from rival groups or tribes. Remember, Cahokia was the dominant force in the region for centuries, and power struggles were common in ancient societies. If Cahokia's leadership was busy fighting off enemies, both external and internal, it could have weakened the city's ability to govern and maintain order, contributing to its eventual downfall. And then there's the big mystery. Did Cahokia suffer from a leadership crisis? As I mentioned earlier, Cahokia's elite class controlled much of the city's wealth, trade, and political decisions. But what happens when that leadership starts to falter? It's possible that Cahokia's ruling class failed to adapt to the changing conditions, whether it was environmental, social, or political. If the leaders of Cahokia couldn't address the challenges facing the city, they might have lost the support of the people. And without strong leadership, Cahokia's highly organized society could have begun to unravel. One thing's for sure, Cahokia didn't just slowly fade away over centuries. Archaeological evidence suggests that the city was largely abandoned by the mid-1300s, and within a few generations, it was essentially a ghost town. This rapid decline left its mark on the region, and the surrounding Mississippian culture suffered a similar fate. What was once the largest and most powerful city in North America north of Mexico became little more than a memory, its great mounds standing as silent witnesses to a lost civilization. And here's where it gets even more interesting. Despite Cahokia's fall, its legacy didn't disappear. The knowledge, ideas, and culture of the Mississippian people continued to influence other Native American societies in the region. The techniques of mound building, the agricultural innovations, and even some of the religious beliefs persisted long after Cahokia's decline. But the city itself? Gone. So what's the real reason for Cahokia's downfall? Was it environmental disaster, social unrest, warfare, a failure of leadership? Honestly, it's probably a combination of all these factors. Civilizations are complex, and their decline is rarely caused by just one thing. It's like a perfect storm of challenges hitting all at once, and Cahokia couldn't weather it. But here's what's really wild. For a long time, Cahokia was forgotten. European settlers who arrived in the area centuries later had no idea that such an advanced civilization once existed there. To them, the mounds were just strange hills dotting the landscape. It wasn't until archaeologists started digging, and I mean literally digging, that we began to piece together the story of Cahokia. And what a story it is. But we're not done yet. In the final segment, we're going to explore Cahokia's lasting legacy and how its rediscovery changed our understanding of ancient North America. Stay tuned, folks. There's still plenty to uncover. So after all this rise and fall, you might be wondering, how did we even come to know about Cahokia? How does a city that was once home to thousands just vanish from the pages of history? Well, it turns out rediscovering Cahokia is a story in itself, one that's deeply tied to the development of archaeology in North America. For centuries, the towering mounds of Cahokia were little more than curiosities to those who encountered them. Early European settlers in the region had no idea that these mounds had once been part of a grand civilization. In fact, they came up with all kinds of outlandish theories about their origins. Some believed the mounds were built by ancient lost civilizations, like the people of Atlantis, or even that they were created by a race of giants. No one could imagine that these structures were the work of indigenous peoples. It was as if they couldn't fathom that Native Americans had the capability to build such complex and monumental structures. But that all started to change in the 19th century when archaeologists, armed with new tools and a fresh perspective, began to seriously investigate the mounds. They dug deep into the earth, uncovering artifacts, bones, and clues that pointed to Cahokia as the center of a once thriving civilization. Slowly but surely, the pieces of the puzzle began to come together, and by the 20th century it became clear. Cahokia wasn't built by mythical giants or lost Atlanteans. It was built by the ancestors of Native Americans, the Mississippians. This realization was a game changer, not just for the study of Cahokia, but for the understanding of pre-Columbian North America as a whole. Today, Cahokia is recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, one of only a few in the United States. It's visited by thousands of people each year who walk the grounds, climb the mounds, and try to imagine what life was like in this bustling city of the past. Archaeologists continue to uncover new findings at Cahokia, piecing together more of its story, but there's still so much we don't know. For example, while we've uncovered artifacts and evidence of the city's structure, there's still mystery surrounding its social and political systems, its relationships with other cultures, and, most intriguingly, why it fell. But Cahokia's story isn't just about ancient history. In many ways, it's a story that still resonates today. Native American tribes, particularly those with ties to the region, see Cahokia as a symbol of their deep and lasting connection to this land. The city's mounds stand as a reminder of the achievements and resilience of indigenous peoples long before European colonization. In a time when so much of American history has been shaped by European narratives, Cahokia serves as a powerful counterpoint, a reminder that great civilizations existed here with complex societies, religions, and economies long before the first colonists arrived. Cahokia also challenges our modern assumptions about what a civilization should look like. There's no evidence that Cahokia had a written language, and yet it managed to govern a vast and complex society. There's no evidence of a money-based economy, and yet trade flourished. And then there's the mounds, simple in design, but profound in meaning. In many ways, Cahokia forces us to rethink how we define progress, success, and civilization itself. It shows us that there's no single path to greatness, and that human ingenuity can take many forms. As we learn more about Cahokia, we're not just filling in the gaps of history, we're also expanding our understanding of what's possible. The rediscovery of Cahokia has opened our eyes to the rich and diverse history of the Americas, challenging the idea that civilizations worth studying only existed in Europe, the Middle East, or Asia. Cahokia is a reminder that this continent has always been a place of innovation, culture, and complexity. And while the city itself may have fallen, its legacy continues to shape the way we think about the past. So, when you next think of ancient civilizations, don't just think of Rome, Greece, or Egypt. Remember Cahokia. Remember the city of mounds, where people lived, thrived, and shaped the course of history in their own unique way. And there you have it, folks. The story of Cahokia, a city that rose to greatness, thrived as a hub of culture, trade, and power, and then vanished into the mists of time, leaving behind its towering mounds and 1,000 unanswered questions. It's a reminder that history is full of surprises that often challenge our assumptions about who built the past and how they did it. As we move forward, let's not forget about Cahokia and other overlooked civilizations that shaped the world we live in today. They've all contributed to the seeds of history that continue to grow and influence our understanding of ourselves and each other. The past isn't just a distant memory. It's a living, breathing part of the present. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into the forgotten metropolis of Cahokia. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on future explorations into history's hidden corners. And, hey, if you're feeling extra generous, leave a review or share this podcast with a friend who might want to dig into the past with us. It's through your support that we can keep uncovering these incredible stories. Got a suggestion for a future episode? Hit me up on social media or drop a comment. I'm always looking for new seeds of history to plant in our upcoming episodes. Until next time, stay curious, keep questioning, and as always, keep the spirit of history alive. I'm Bennett Tanton, and this is Seeds of History. Thanks for listening.